Servlets Part 2, Database Connected Servlets. What I want to do now is go through a couple of kind of real world examples with you of how you can use servlets, Tomcat, and HTML pages to make a pretty cool tool that allows you to generate a web page and then use a servlet as the middle tier between you and your database and generate some dynamic HTML. Let's take a look at the schema of the application first before we jump right into the code. As I've mentioned earlier, servlets are great for that middle tier. As a matter of fact, it's really sometimes the only viable option that you have. You see, you have a database over here. This contains maybe some kind of corporate data. And maybe it's an e-commerce, it could be any kind of database. Maybe it's doing online transaction, OLTP, maybe for an e-commerce site or just basically a search engine. And let's just say this is some kind of relational database management system. For our example, I'm going to be using Microsoft, and it's important that I stress Microsoft because I want you to see how I can combine various technologies together. Microsoft SQL 2000 Server. So let's see what we're going to be using here. Over here, I've got a client. And for all intents and purposes, this person could be using any kind of web browser. Really, the HTML that I've done this with is so basic and so straightforward that any web browser will go ahead and be able to process it. I'll just put the big two, NN, Netscape Navigator, or IE, Internet Explorer. So we're going to use, in our example, we'll use MS Internet Explorer, and that's because I'm using Windows XP. All right, so what's going on over here? Well, here is the servlet slash web server. Okay, so this is our servlet server. It's also our, let me make that a little better. It's also our web server. Okay. Now, what we're using for both is Apache Tomcat. That is what we're using for both here. So let's see the process. What is going to be going on here? One thing I want to explain or kind of reiterate to you is that, remember, when a web client makes a request to the web server, the HTTP request is made. The web server receives the request. Let's say it's in the format of an HTML page here. Okay. Web server receives the request. Then it streams back HTML to the client, and then HTML is processed and rendered on the client here. So because the processing and rendering is happening on the client here, once that server responds, okay, remember, request, response, okay, yes, that does correlate to our HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Once the server responds, you're cut off. So, and you're all processing on your client. So how in the world are you supposed to kind of come and talk to this guy? Well, the answer is that you cannot do it. So you need to use a servlet. So that's the problem. So how does a servlet solve this? Well, let's take a look. What a servlet's going to do is it's going to also, okay, we're going to make a request, okay, but now, because let's say we're using a form whose action is the servlet does some processing here first. In this particular example, it's going to hit the SQL server, get the results, and it's going to connect with JDBC for us, okay? It's going to return some data for us. Then we generate the results as HTML back to the client. Okay? So notice how what we do before when we're dealing with a servlet, and this will be true of a JSP page too, is any kind of server-side technology. Something happens on the server first. The processing has happened before it's sent. If you just ask or make a request of a .html page, a web server is essentially just a glorified internet file server at that point. But if you make a request of a servlet, a .jsp, a .asp, a .aspx, a .php, a .cfm, something has to happen on the servlet first. I'm sorry, on the server first. Then it goes ahead and it streams HTML back to the client. The first thing we need to do is start up Tomcat. Pretty cool trick to do, and I haven't done it yet. So let's jump out and do that. Let's go into the Tomcat directory, into the bin directory, and into our bin directory here. And let's create a shortcut on our desktop to help us kind of stop and start or shut down Tomcat. So here we've got the startup.bat. So I'm going to create a shortcut to that. And then we have the shutdown.bat. And I'm going to create a shortcut to that. Okay. So done with that. And I'm going to double click the icon here. It's gonna, now this again is a feature of Windows XP Service Pack 2, very secure. But you see we're going to start up Tomcat, and this will just look like our normal DOS command prompt, normal, command window here that we're usually used to seeing when we start. And we start up fairly quickly. Let's take a look at the first example. The first example is one in which we're allowed to enter in a couple of different searches. So I'm going to go to localhost rb test1, and let's just bring up the root directory. And the first example is going to be a simple search .html. So I'll go ahead and click on it. And we can enter some search criteria. For example, I'm going to enter blank. If you enter blank, you're going to get everything back. And you could see up at the top, search equals blank here. So you could see I get chai, chang. This is basically different foods or products that's listed in a products table. Okay. Let's do how about a search on things that start with LOU. Okay, so let me click back here. Let's do a search on things that start with LOU, and I'm going to hit search. Now you'll notice up at the top we have a simple search question mark, txt search equals LOU, and now we're just starting to see a couple of things that come back only with Louise or LOU in it. In this example, we just get Louisiana fiery hot pepper sauce or Louisiana hot spiced okra. There was a couple of things with chai, so how about let's just do CH. See what we get there. Oh, we get chai, chang, Chef Anton, so-and-so. We got Sasquatch Ale. We get all sorts of things. Well, what makes this application tick? So let me hop out into my Java Servlets 2 directory, and this is kind of like where I do all my development. And we've got my HTML files here. Now again, this is where I've got my development going on. I don't have Tomcat looking to run anything from this directory just yet. Let's take a look at simplesearch.html. Open that up with our friend TextPad here. And it's a basic web page. It's a .html, so nothing tricky. I've got a head, rather an HTML, a head, a title, a head, a body, and here's where it gets fairly, nothing, again, it's fairly simple. I created an HTML form, I gave it a name. I specified a method of get. Because it's a method of get, let's run this simple one here one more time. Let's go into my simple search. Because it's a method of get, the query string contains the parameters that I'm searching for. And as a result, it's not as secure. However, you'll see that it's a lot faster. You see this query string up here? It's available. So you don't want to do things like user ID and passwords up here because, well, somebody looking over your shoulder, they can see that. So in another example, I'll show you the alternative to using a get. Notice if you don't specify a method of get, if you just leave this whole thing out, it's not even there, well, the default method is get, but I went ahead and specified it. Now the action, this is what to do when the submit button is clicked. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to call my simple search servlet. And all I have in here is an input type of text, a text box with the name of txt search. Okay, so now let's go ahead and check out the simple search.java file that I use to, or that contains really the code that makes that servlet work. Drag and drop that into TextPad, and here we go. Now, you're probably pretty comfortable with these 3 lines here. Okay, import java.io, and import javax.servlet, and import javax.servlet.http, because those 3 are the standards of what we need to make a fundamental servlet. Now here is import java.sql. This is specifically for utilizing the classes in that package that allow me to have JDBC access. In other words, those classes that allow me to contact a database server. Now, here I've got my public class simple search, which extends HTTP servlet, nothing tricky. And here I have my public void do-get with the parameters that it's supposed to take, HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response, and it throws the appropriate exceptions, servlet and IO exceptions. Then from here on out, it's fairly straightforward JDBC programming. For example, class.forename to load the Microsoft SQL Server 2000 JDBC driver that I downloaded from Microsoft.com. Here, I'm creating a connection calling the driver manager.get connection, and I'm specifying the URL, user ID, and password that I'm going to use when establishing the connection. Here I create my statement object by calling the connection create statement. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting. This is servlet programming right here. See, the request, if you remember, HTTP servlet request contains information coming into the servlet, and it has a method called getParameter, and you specify a string to it. Now, what does that string correlate? Well, notice it's txt search. If I go back to my HTML form, I have an input type whose name is txt search. So calling this method, request.getParameter, or rec.getParameter, and specifying the name in here of an HTML form element, it will return to me a string containing that data. And I simply called it search criteria. So I created a result set by calling the statements execute query. And look at my query. Select product name unit price from northwind.dbo.products where the product name is like, and notice how I appended into there my search criteria. Remember, in SQL programming, the %sign is the wildcard. So basically I'm saying search the database and give me information about the product's name, the product's unit price from the products table where the product name is like anything I want, surrounded by the wildcards. All right, let's kind of continue down. And this is important here because I'm using the response objects. Remember, the response is controlling output from the servlet back to the client. I'm using the setContentType method, and I'm specifying that this is going to be HTML. Then I use the response getWriter method to get my print writer, and I start printing out. Here, I'm setting up an HTML table. So I'm using the print writer out println method, and I'm just writing HTML. Table, make it center, border of 1, border color of black. Okay, nothing too fancy there. Here again is straightforward JDBC programming. The result set next returns true or false and iterates to the next result. So while it's true, use my print writer out print line method and write a row, write a table data or a cell, okay, and use the result set first column. Notice how I close the TD, open the table, then the second column, okay? Then what I did is I said, if it's true, basically, write the next row, but change the highlighted color to light blue. That's why if you look at the result set, it alternates between white and light blue, white and light blue, white and light blue. And that's because I'm doing the test. If it's true, if the result set exists, write another one, but make it light blue. Of course, I close my statement and my connection. I have to catch, because I'm using JDBC and I'm loading a driver, I have to catch class not found exception and SQL exception. And if I go ahead and get those, I'm going to write. Notice here I'm using response.getWriter, not using my PW out. I'm just calling response.getWriter dot, okay? You're not seeing anything, that this is a method, a linked method, if you will, okay? Just connecting the method calls here. Response.getWriter, this gives me a print writer, dot print line, and then the error that I have. Now, a couple of things that you need to know that are really important in order to pull this off. Let's jump into the servlets. Well, let me go into the, let's do a quick explore of my computer. When I download the drivers from Microsoft, okay, for SQL Server, and I install those drivers, it goes ahead and it puts them by default into the program files, Microsoft SQL Server drivers for JDBC, and it puts them in the lib directory, Okay, if I want all of my web applications running on my Tomcat server to be able to see those, what I can do is I can go into my common lib directory and copy those files into there. So that's why you have MS Base, MS SQL Server in there, as well as MS Util. These three files here I copied into the common lib directory of where you install Tomcat. And then what happens is all web applications can have access to those jar files. And that's something that you can, kind of remember as you go along here. If you need specific access to a specific jar file and you want all of your web applications to have access to it, put it in the common lib directory. All right? Then we go ahead and deploy the servlet. So here is the simple servlet class file, and I deploy that by jumping into my Tomcat directory. So let's go into Tomcat and Jakarta Tomcat. I go to the web apps. Here's my application, rbtest1. Go into there. And in the web-inf in the classes directory, I drop my simple search. Okay. Then don't forget, modify your web.xml file to reflect the fact that you're loading up a servlet whose name is simple search, the class, as well as how you're going to map it. And I like to do this trick of just using slash in the name of the servlet so I don't have to put servlet into the URL. And that's how that basic simple searching servlet works. The next one I want to take a look at is a little bit more complicated JDBC programming, but still very much the same principle that I just showed you in terms of servlet programming. All right, let's hop out to my rbtest1. And this is, I called NWin search, but in real life I could search any database I want. But because I was doing a NWin search, I'm just using Northwind. When you download Microsoft, or when you install rather, Microsoft SQL Server, you put in the Northwind database. Now watch this. Let's run through this first. I specify the name of the driver, the default driver loads, the database URL, okay, and I put in a user ID and a password. And I'll go ahead and put in a password here. And now I can simply say select star from northwind.database owner customers and run that query, and my servlet will tell me the database product name, Microsoft SQL Server, and the product version of SQL Server that I'm running. I'm using SQL Server 8, really 2000, Service Pack 2. Okay, and what it does is it builds through that and it gives me everything in there because I said start. Now, what I like about this example is it's a little bit smarter than the last example because I can simply put in select distinct city. Okay, let me put in my password here. And what it will do is it automatically knows how to, it dynamically counts the number of columns and returns those columns for me and all that good stuff. Watch this. Notice here I'm leaving the password blank. If I hit submit query, look at this. Login failed for SA. Well, because I'm trying to log in with an incorrect password. Notice too that when you type the password, it's just dots. Well, how did I do that? So let's take a look at how I built this particular application. Let me jump back into my dev directory, which is the servlets 2 directory. And I'm going to drag and drop the search_nwin.html file onto there and the search or the nwin search.java, which is basically the servlet. Let's start off with the easy stuff, the HTML. Well, it's HTML. Nothing too complicated going on here. Now, there is one thing that is different because if I do take a look at the form, I gave it a name, but look at this, method of post. You have to explicitly specify method of post. Again, if you leave that out, leave it blank, get is the default. Notice here in the example, let's do another example here. I'm going to go ahead and take my user ID and password out. I'm going to put my user ID there, password there, and we'll do a select star from northwind.dbo.products. Okay. Now, the important thing to see here is, of course, the servlet's going to work, but what's missing from the top? You don't see a question mark and any sort of parameters here. This is because a method of post. A method of post is a little bit slower, okay, because the data is encrypted in the HTTP packets. However, it's a lot more secure. The action is where do I go when I click the submit button? And I'm going to go to nwin search. Notice again, I just think it's pretty interesting with servlets, you just specify the name of the servlet. You don't put .class or .jsp. You don't do that. There's no .file extension. Okay, so this is essentially a table. And in the table, I'm specifying some default values. Like here's a driver, okay, and I've got an input type of text. The name of it's txt driver, and here's the default value. Here's the database URL with a default value, etc., etc., etc. Nothing too tricky going on here. Here is the servlet. Okay, so again, I have to add the import java.sql because I'm using JDBC. Other than that, it's a very straightforward servlet. Now, this method is the first time I think I'm showing you the do post method because we're doing a method of post. So method of post, do post. Method of get, do get. However, the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response and the throwing of the servlet exception and IO exception are verbatim, just exactly as if you were doing a do get. Same thing too. I'm streaming HTML back to my client. So I set my content type using the response HTTP servlet response objects, set content type method, and I specify, hey, this is text HTML coming back at you. Again, I use the HTTP servlet responses get writer method to give me a print writer, and I just start building HTML. So here's the head, or rather the HTML tag, the head, the title, the body, specify a H2, a heading size of 2. I centered it. Notice that I had to use the escape characters because I wanted double quotes there. So if you want to use double quotes, this is just string manipulation, but I'll just remind you, you can't use double quotes inside double quotes. So you have to escape them out with the backslash. Okay, then I print out my HTML. Then what I'm using is I'm using my getParameter method of my request. Let's go ahead and split this, tile it horizontally. For example, let's take a look at the various get parameters. Okay, I want to get my driver. In other words, I created this default driver that loads in the HTML page. So let's see this. This is the default here. What if you wanted to use a different driver to connect to the SQL Server, like the Sun JDBC driver or an OLADB driver or something like that? Well, then you could type something in here, otherwise you use the default. So what I did was I've got a txt driver, which is that input type. I've given it the default value. So I use request.getParameter txt driver, set it to driver. I use txt URL for the database URL. Again, I specify a value of a default URL. Notice I'm putting the user ID and password in there as well. A txt user for the username, txt password, and all that query stuff. That's an HTML text area, if you're not familiar with that. The text area is what gives me the larger, multiple selectable rows in there. Otherwise, I would have an input type of text, which is one word. By the way, this password, saying input type of password, by saying it's password, that's what allows me to put the dots there instead of characters that you would see here. And then other than that, you treat it just like a normal text, okay? And that's just the HTML. So I'm basically gathering all of my information. Then it's straight JDBC programming. I load my driver from driver. I establish a connection. Now here I'm getting some database metadata, and I'll show you why I'm doing that here. I'm doing that because I'm going to start building a list, and I want to put in the database product name and database product version, and in order to get information about your database, you use the database metadata because it's metadata, okay? Then I create a connection. Notice I haven't even connected, and I'm able to go ahead and rather create a statement here, but I'm able to go ahead and, before I even create a statement, get my metadata. I create a statement, and then I call the execute query method on the query, and then I start using the print writer out to print an HTML table. Notice the backslash double quote, backslash double quote. I'm escaping that out. And I use my result set, and I call the metadata on the result set. And the result set metadata has a get column count, which tells me how many columns are in the result set. And what I can do is I can print on a row and loop through that row, okay, loop through the columns, essentially, and build a heading for each column. So I'm saying, give me the number of columns stored in a variable called cols of type integer. For int equals 1, because the first column is 1, and it's less than or equal to the number of columns, increment it, and print out a table heading with the column name. Pretty cool little trick. Then close the row. Then again here, what I've showed you before, while the reader moves to the next line, print out a table row, loop through the cols, and get the string value from that, close the row, close the table, close the body, close the HTML, close all my result sets and my connections, and do my appropriate catch blocks. Catch class not found, SQL exception, and exception. And voila, there you have it. You get a pretty little cool app that allows you to basically enter anything in as far as a query, change the driver, change the database you're using, as well as the user ID and password. Again, to deploy it, I simply go out to my web-inf directory into my classes. So I go to my Jakarta. I go to my web apps directory. I go to my application, web-inf, classes, and you'll see NWin search. Also, just as you would expect, I have to modify my web.xml file to specify the servlet name and its class, as well as specify the servlet mappings. And it's just like the other one in case of that. Notice how I've got Tomcat running. Let me double click on shortcut to shut down Tomcat, run that, and that's going to start shutting Tomcat down. And you can see that it's going to shut her down, and I'm all set. And that just instantly goes away. In Servlets Part 2, Database Connected Servlets, I went over a couple of things you need to do in order to create servlets that utilize JDBC. For the most part, it's very straightforward. If you understand JDBC, if you understand servlets, it's a marriage of the two. I think one of the things that you have to really remember is to jump out to the common lib directory and deploy your your driver.jar files into that lib directory in the common of your Jakarta installation if you want everybody to have access to that. I hope you have found this informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.